Hospitals are very dangerous places. You go in, you develop an infection there, you die. It costs over $40 billion a year. Most of these infections are transmitted interpersonally from healthcare workers who pick up the infection on their hands from one patient. They shake hands with somebody in the hallway, they go in to see another patient, they transmit the infection. A simple checklist in which the healthcare worker has to check off the procedure they have followed, including washing their hands, and they check each other to see that they have followed the checklist, reduces the infection rate to 0 in hospitals in which it is systematically applied. So you go from the 4th leading cause of death to 0 based on the simple application of a checklist, and this has been demonstrated in randomized trials. Let me turn to business. How many of you know Google, the search engine? Does everybody know Google? Okay, good. So Google carries out over 12,000 experiments a year. Whether the ad pops up on the right-hand side of the page or the left-hand side of the page, whether it's in boldface or italics, how long it is, what happens when you click on it, how long it takes. Every aspect of the design of Google is systematically varied. They get the results. About 10% of these 12,000 experiments produce differences that are positive, and they change their practices. In general, competitive businesses in the international arena have turned increasingly to randomized trials and other ways of systematically collecting evidence on what works to determine their business practices. Capital One, a large international credit card company, carries out over 60,000 experiments a year. If they mail you an offer in a blue envelope, they've tested whether a blue envelope works better than a white envelope. And they credit their success to the systematic experimental nature of their business practices. Las Vegas is full of casinos. I described to you a quote from an executive in one of the largest casinos there, Harrah's. Las Vegas, as you may know, is out in the desert, and the only way they get customers is to draw them in from California. So, should you send a discount offer for a hotel room to a particular population in California? Will that increase your business? They do such experiments by randomly selecting from their customer list, sending out the offer to that randomly selected subsample, comparing the results with the sample not selected. Here is what a manager at Harrah's says. There are 3 things that can lose your job at Harrah's: harassing women, stealing money, and not having a control group. That's how committed they are to learning from experience. Okay, let me turn to education. In 1971, President Reagan's Commission on School Finance commissioned the Rand Corporation to review research on what was known about what works in education. The Finance Commission reasoned that the wise expenditure of public funds for education must be based on knowledge of which investments produce results and which do not. So it very reasonably asked Rand to determine which kind of things worked and which did not, so it could advise the president in which directions to address finance, increased funding. This is what Rand concluded in their report, again in 1971. The body of education research now available leaves much to be desired, at least by comparison with the level of understanding that has been achieved in numerous other fields. Research has found nothing that consistently and unambiguously makes a difference in student outcomes. 1971, research has found nothing that makes a difference. Almost 30 years later, in 1999, the National Academies of Science in the United States was commissioned to do a similar report on education research. Here is what they concluded, and I quote, "One striking fact is that the complex world of education, unlike defense, healthcare, or industry, does not rest on a strong research base, and no other field or personal experience and ideology so frequently relied on to make policy choices, and in no other field is the research base so inadequate and little used." So a weaker form of the same conclusion from 1971. We don't know anything from research about what to do in education. In comparison to the sad state of affairs in education that existed in the 20th century, the 21st century has seen an explosion of rigorous and relevant research. And that research provides for the first time a foundation for evidence-based education. What is evidence-based education? It's the use of the best currently available empirical evidence to make policy and practice decisions. So just as the manager of the casino uses the best evidence to decide what offers to send out to attract customers or what the lighting should be in the casino to encourage people to gamble, so in education, decisions about policy and practice should be based on evidence of what works best. Evidence-based education requires a supply of evidence. It requires processes for synthesizing and disseminating that evidence to those who might use it. And most importantly, it requires a demand for evidence from those in a position to influence practice and policy. You can build it, but they do not necessarily come. And so, as I go through my talk, I want to talk about, in particular, the need for demand for evidence and what it takes to produce it. So I promised you that I would I'll give you two examples, one about choice and competition, and one about teachers. I will start with the example with regard to teachers. In 2002, I was serving at the Deputy Secretary level in the United States Department of Education, responsible for research, evaluation, and statistics. The White House organized a conference on teacher quality, and I was asked to present to the audience what was known from research about teacher quality. I think I made a good presentation because I wasn't criticized afterwards for misstating the evidence, and it was easy to be criticized in that role if you took a misstep. And I looked back at my PowerPoint from that conference before I came here to see what I had said. And I had said, we know three things about teachers. We know that they matter, and indeed there was some research to demonstrate that they matter. But this is like saying it's important to have oxygen in order to breathe. It is something that I think is so obvious that I'm not sure that the research community was telling us much. So if I ask you, let me ask you to raise your hand if you remember a teacher in your life that was good and had an effect on you, an effect that you can still recall. Yes, almost everybody. And how about the opposite? Can you remember, a terrible teacher who you would not wish anybody to have to, yes. So we have this strong intuition. And what the research was telling us is that the intuition is correct. There are good teachers and bad teachers, but that's about all we knew. We knew in the United States that the quality of the teacher pool was becoming worse as measured by their college entrance scores. So back when the only professions available to women were teaching and nursing, the best and the brightest women were going into teaching and nursing. And as those doors, the doors to the rest of the economy opened up and women were employable throughout the workforce, they were less likely to go into teaching, and the quality of those entering the teaching profession was going down. We knew that in 2002. And the third thing that we knew was that a good curriculum raises the performance of all teachers. A rising tide lifts all ships. And so if you give teachers something good to work with, they tend to get better results than if they do not have good tools. That's what we knew in 2002 in the United States. And what was policy then? We just passed a new federal law called the No Child Left Behind Act, and it had a significant section that focused on teachers, and it was all about credentials. The aim was to see that every child in every classroom had a teacher who had a credential, a teaching degree that was certified and that came from a regular teacher training institution. The idea being that teachers who had temporary certificates, who were not trained as teachers, were not good for kids, and so that every child should have a quality teacher defined by the credential of the teacher. So that was 2002, both what we knew and the policy that was present in the United States. And what do we know now? Well, I could spend several hours talking to you about what we know now about teachers that's new in the last decade. One of the things we know going to the importance of teachers is not just that they matter, but how much they matter. We know that for children in 4th and 5th grade in the United States, 9 and 10-year-olds, that the difference, if you will imagine in your head a bell-shaped normal curve for a moment, that the difference for a child between having a teacher who is at the 25th percentile on that curve versus a teacher who is at the 75th percentile on that curve, not the extremes now, but basically one standard deviation plus or minus the average of teacher effectiveness, that the difference for a child in the pretty good teacher's classroom versus the below average teacher's classroom is the difference of 4 months of learning a year over the course of 1 year. So children who are in the classroom of the below average teacher at the end of a year are 4 months behind the children who are in the classroom of the above average teacher. And that occurs with random assignment. It's not that what I'm telling you is biased by the fact that the teacher who seems to be the good teacher gets the good kids. It's children, just as in the streptomycin trial, are randomly assigned to teachers who are known to be good based on their past performance versus teachers who are known to be below average. 4 months. School year in the United States lasts 9 months. Almost half a year of difference over the course of 1 year due to teacher differences. We know that these differences in 5th grade have long-term effects on student outcomes. We have a very dramatic study conducted in New York City that takes advantage of the fact that New York has had a data system that tracks individual students for over 20 years. And the identity of those students can be cleverly attached to federal tax records 20 years later. So you were in 5th grade, you're now 30 years old. I can look at your tax returns and I can see how much you're earning. And I can go back to 5th grade and ask whether you had an above average or below average teacher. Just on the basis of 5th grade differences in teacher effectiveness, people at 30 years of age are more or less likely to have gone to college, and they're earning more if they had an effective 5th grade teacher. Now, in the United States, you'll have at least 13 teachers over the course of your lifetime. Differences in college-going rates and labor market returns based on one effective teacher are already dramatic. Imagine if those differences could accumulate over 13 years. 13 really effective teachers would almost surely have amazing differences on outcomes. We know in the United States that now we know credentials do not make a difference. So all the emphasis in 2002 on making sure that teachers had a credential has turned out to be bad policy. We now know through systematic studies that routes into the teaching profession, traditional teacher education, alternative certification programs where teachers start teaching without a teaching degree and then pick up some courses while they're teaching, versus very radical entrance paths, such as what in America is called Teach for America and what is called in Britain Teach First. Basically, they all produce the same outcomes for students. Teach for America or Teach First is a program in which students who graduate from elite colleges with no special degree or training in teaching volunteer to teach for 2 years in a classroom. The only instruction they have is 6 weeks of summer school before they start teaching. We now have systematic results from randomized trials showing that those teachers produce gains for students that are larger in math and equivalent in reading to teachers who are traditionally trained. So the whole policy emphasis in the US has shifted from teacher quality measured by degrees and credentials to teacher effectiveness measured by on-the-job performance. What we've learned is that we can't tell who's going to be a good teacher based on where they were trained or what degree they've had. The only way we can find out who's a good teacher is to see who's a good teacher. That past performance in the classroom is the best predictor of future performance in the classroom. So policy has changed dramatically as a result. The Obama administration has incentivized states. The 50 states in the US are responsible for education, not the federal government. But the federal government has incentivized, that is, made a significant financial award available to states that choose to put in place meaningful teacher evaluation systems that have the potential of distinguishing the more effective teachers from the really bad teachers, providing a ladder for career advancement and more salary to the really effective teachers, and encouraging the really bad teachers, now not the 25th percentile teacher, but the 5th percentile teacher, the really bad teacher, to think about working somewhere else other than in schools. Again, I stress that this is not a policy. I'm suggesting we'll work in Turkey. I'm telling you, it is the course of policy change in the United States. Let me turn to choice and competition. In the US, about 10% of students go to private schools. I'm talking about primary and secondary students. About 10% go to private schools. The parents pay the tuition there themselves. 90% go to public schools that are free, and the tuition is paid by the local government with help from the states and from the federal government. The traditional pattern of delivering that public education to students has been based on place of residence. And so if you purchase a home or rent an apartment in a particular geography that can be identified usually by your mailing zip code, historically, that's determined where your child will go to school if you're availing yourself of a public education. It's referred to now somewhat dismissively in the US as zip code education, place-based education. It's only in the last 15 years that the U.S. has begun to experiment with the availability of choice in primary and secondary education. Choice occurs primarily in two forms as a matter of policy, and by far the most prevalent form is something called the charter school. The charter school is a public school. It is paid for with public funds. Students in the charter school are subject to the same testing and accountability as students in traditional zip code, district-based public schools. But the charter schools, unlike the traditional district schools, have no regulations that govern the way they provide their services other than safety regulations, fire escapes in the building and that sort of thing. So they can hire whatever teachers they want. They can compensate them in any way they wish. They can extend the school day into the afternoon and night and Saturdays. They can require various things of parents who wish to enroll their children in the school. So the government is very tight on the goals. Everyone eventually has to do well on the same state-sponsored test, but very loose on the specification of how to achieve those goals. Each charter school can do it its own way. In contrast to the traditional public schools that are tight both on goals and on means to achieve those goals. A lot of specification of who may be hired, how much they may be paid, how long the school day can be, who can do what within the school. A very traditional system that is difficult to change. It is a status quo. That means that if I do a school visit to a traditional public school almost anywhere in the United States today, I will be completely at home if the last time I was in a school, a public school, was the last time I was in a public school in 1962. So in 50 years, very little has changed in terms of traditional classroom instruction. And I think that's true around the world, that things look pretty much the way they used to. In charter schools, they are at least freed to innovate if they want. What we have now are randomized trials designed in the same way as the streptomycin medical trial in 1947 that take advantage of the fact that these charter schools, which now serve about 7% of the United States public school population, and in some cities like Washington, D.C., serve nearly 50% of the population. These schools tend to be very popular. They are oversubscribed. More parents want to enroll their child than there are seats available for those children. And so it's required by federal law that when there is oversubscription, there is a lottery. And so the children who are selected to attend are chosen randomly rather than chosen by who they know or their test scores or anything else. And while this is intended to produce equity, it is a tremendous boon for researchers because it is an experiment. And the experiment is the comparison of those children who by luck were admitted into the charter school versus those children who by luck failed to be admitted. And so you have a program group, the charter school group, and a comparison group. Just like the casino in Las Vegas compares the people to whom it sent the letter with the free offer with the people who did not receive the letter. And what's been found from those studies? Well, first, what's been found is that having charter school in your name is no guarantee that you will be a better school. And so, on average, across the United States, charter schools are performing no better than traditional public schools. But for geographical areas and school districts and large urban areas where the school-age population is poor, minority, non-English speaking, these charter schools are producing dramatically better results than the traditional public schools who are not doing a very good job. And so the difference by 8th grade can be a difference in 2 years of learning. So children in the charter schools who got in by lottery are 2 years ahead of comparable children who lost the lottery and ended up in traditional public schools. The difference for parent satisfaction is even more dramatic. Parents are wildly satisfied with the charter school experience their children are getting compared to really the same parents who lost the chance to go to those charter schools and are attending regular public school. College, high school graduation rates are greater. College enrollment rates are greater. So in the context in which it's been studied in terms of charter schools, choice provides opportunities that would not otherwise occur. And one of the advantages of the light regulatory framework is that charter schools are free to innovate. And so what we get from the charter school sector are practices and programs that are new and that have the promise of revolutionizing the delivery of education in general. One example is in the use of technology in schools. The traditional public school sector has been resistant to any technology that is disruptive. One of the characteristics of technology is that it increases productivity. The downside of increasing productivity is you need less people employed to generate the same outcome. And so if you are employed in a traditional public school setting, the last thing you want is the introduction of an innovative technology that might cost you your job. That's not the case for charter schools. And so there are groups of charter schools that have been introducing something called blended learning. The way blended learning works for, let's say, a middle school student in 7th grade is that that child will spend 1/3 of the school day experiencing instruction digitally through the internet or through digital learning materials that are on the computer the child has in the school. These materials, by the way, are not very good. They are materials that have been collected for free off the internet and made available. They could be a lot better. The other 2/3 of the day, that child and other children will go to a classroom with a teacher and they will discuss the materials the child has experienced over the internet. They will engage in discussion with each other. They will engage in interactions and learning opportunities. The teacher's role is no longer to deliver the content. It's to encourage students to engage with the content, to discuss it, and learn from it. The results of the blended learning experience are, to date, that students are doing no worse. To put it in another way, they are performing at the same level as students in a traditional classroom. But the blended learning schools require about 1/3 smaller workforce than the schools that are traditional. So there's a tremendous increase in productivity with no negative effect on students, either their academic outcomes or their engagement with school. Students in blended learning classrooms tend to like it. I've said that the teaching materials, the digital materials, are not very good. As they get better, as I think they surely will, the potential for the digital transformation is extremely large. So what we have from choice and competition is the opportunity to innovate, the opportunity to disrupt by doing things that the traditional system will not allow, the opportunity for parents to choose and to not be limited by wealth or geography in terms of the quality of their child, the quality of the school their child can attend, therefore greater equity. One of the things I do in the United States is my center at Brookings, the Brown Center, publishes an annual review of choice and competition in the 100 largest cities in the United States. And we talk about what those large urban districts could do to enhance choice. We do that recognizing that the current situation, even with charter schools, is not nearly as good as it might be with regard to choice. So what do we recommend? We recommend that every parent have the maximum possible choice of schools. These are good traditional schools, charter public schools, affordable private schools, and increasingly for students in high school, virtual education, online education. We recommend that these districts create choice processes that maximize the match between what parents want and what they get. The Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded this year to someone who designed a choice system for education that maximizes that match, that presents to parents choices arranged in a way that assures that overall the distance between what parents want and what they end up getting for their child is as small as possible. We recommend that public funds follow the child to the child's school of choice, so that there are consequences for schools that are popular versus schools that are unpopular. Unpopular schools lose funding, popular schools gain funding, they grow. Just as would happen in business, the bad restaurant eventually goes out of business, the good restaurant grows and is successful. And we recommend that there be subsidies for the cost of choice for poor families, in particular with regard to transportation. When I came into the facility this morning, I saw a whole fleet of very attractive school buses. They are there so that people who exercise choice by attending this facility can get their children here. And so what we recommend in the US is that parents choose and that the state help them exercise that choice by providing the buses and the public transportation to get children to the school of choice. These two examples